Good evening, everyone. I'm Olivia Las Gonzalez, the Executive Director of San Francisco Camerawork, and I want to welcome you all to Towards the Eternal, Reflections on Black Futurity and Imagining, a panel conversation with Nykelle DeVivo and Mikael Owunna, and moderated by Ra Malika Imhotep. This program is organized in conjunction with the FORECAST 2021 exhibit, now on view online on our website. Before we begin our program tonight, we would first like to acknowledge the original inhabitants of this land that many of us call home. We are called San Francisco Camerawork, and what is now San Francisco is on the stolen land of the Ohlone and Ramaytush people, to whom we owe a collective debt. We thank the indigenous peoples of the Bay Area for stewarding this land throughout the generations. We've all benefited from being settlers on this land, and I am incredibly grateful. I would love it if all of you who have joined us would let us know where you are joining from tonight with the present name of the place and the name of the original inhabitants. Please drop your responses in the chat, and you can look them up on the website that we have just dropped in. Before I introduce our panelists and the moderator, I just want to share a few upcoming programs with you. Be sure not to miss the upcoming artist talks with Trent Bozeman on Tuesday, January 25th from 6 to 7 p.m. Pacific time. And Nykelle DeVivo, who joins us on this panel tonight, will also be giving a more in-depth look at his practice in an individual artist talk on Tuesday, February 15, 2022. Our February members portfolio critique will be held by Lewis Watts on Tuesday, February 8th from 6 to 8 p.m. and that's Pacific time again. And the March portfolio critique will be led by Sandy Haber-Fifield on Thursday, March 10th, a little earlier from 5 to 7 p.m. Pacific Standard, because she will be joining us from the East Coast. There are many more programs scheduled and planned in conjunction with the FORECAST exhibit, so please visit our website to see additional programs there. So now to introduce our speakers. Nykelle DeVivo joins us from Portland, Oregon tonight and studied critical theory and photography at San Francisco Art Institute before going on to be published in articles such as Ain't Bad and ID. Their work has been shown in group shows across the country, and they have assisted journalists for projects in the New York Times, the California Sunday Magazine, and more. DeVivo uses photography as a language to understand their evolving sense of self, and in their work refers to histories of Afro-spiritualism and expressions of Black queer joy. Photographing ethereal bodies of light, sensual self-portraits, and quiet moments of prayer, their images act as a portal between timeless states of being and the physical world they inhabit. Mikael Owunna is a queer Nigerian-American multimedia artist, filmmaker, and engineer, exploring the intersections of visual media with engineering, optics, Blackness, and African cosmologies. His work seeks to elucidate an emancipatory vision of possibility that pushes people beyond all boundaries, restrictions, and frontiers. Owunna's work has been exhibited across Africa, Asia, Europe, and North America, and has been collected by institutions such as the Nasher Museum of Art, Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Equal Justice Initiative, Duke University, National Taiwan Museum, and many more. His work has also been featured in media ranging from the New York Times to CNN, NPR, Vice, and The Guardian. He has lectured at venues including Harvard Law School, World Press Photography in the Netherlands, Tate Modern in the UK, and TEDx. Owunna has published 2 monographs, Limitless Africans, Photo Evidence 2019, and Cosmologies, Clamp Art 2021. Owunna's multimedia practice includes film, and in 2021, he directed the dance film Obi Mabu, The Primordial House, an Igbo creation myth with Marquez Red. Owunna's work has been commissioned for major public art installations by organizations including the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra, Cleveland Foundation, the Contemporary Art Museum, Raleigh, Pittsburgh International Airport, and Orange Barrel Media. And he is represented by Clamp Art, New York City. Ra Malika Imhotep is a Black feminist writer and performance artist from Atlanta, Georgia, currently pursuing a PhD in African diaspora studies and new media studies from the University of California. As a scholar and cultural worker, Ra is invested in exploring relationships between queer Black femininities, Black vernacular cultures, and the performance of labor. As a steward of Black studies and Black feminist thought, Ra dreams, organizes, and facilitates spaces of critical reflection and embodied spiritual political education. Ra is co-author of the Black Feminist Studies Theory Atlas and author of Gossipin', Red Hen Press, Spring 2022. They are also a co-convener of the Church of Black Feminist Thought and a member of the Black Aesthetic Curatorial Collective. So we're really excited to have you all on this panel, and please help me welcome our presenters, and I will turn the floor over to you, Ra. I did also want to quickly mention that Nykelle won the Juror's Choice Award for our FORECAST show, which I neglected to mention, but very excited about that as well. So anyway, I will turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. Good evening and welcome. From wherever you are to wherever we are now. I'm so honored to be in conversation with such brilliant artists, and I mean that in every sense of the word, thinking about its root and shine, and just its clear resonance in the like deeply embodied intelligences that you all bring through the medium of photography. By way of introduction, I wanted to offer an anchor thought and an anchor quote. So as a writer and performance artist and scholar who's deeply invested in playful, unconventional, yet necessary representations of Blackness, I feel particularly drawn to the work of myth. And this week, literally, I've been returning over and over again to the work of Sun Ra, my namesake in some ways. In particular, this song called Mystery Mr. Ra, where he says over and over again in an almost haunting refrain, I'm not a part of history. I belong to the myth. I belong to the splendor. And that just feels like the thought, the energy, or a thought and energy that I would like to bring into this space of conversation with us. And the second anchor quote that I would like to just bring here to guide us comes from Sonia Sanchez. And it's a poem that she wrote that was performed beautifully by Sweet Honey in the Rock, this Black woman a cappella folk magic ensemble led by Bernice Johnson Regan. And in this letter to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who we just celebrated yesterday, Sonia Sanchez writes, Black is the beginning of everything. It was Black in the universe before the sun. It was Black in the mind before we opened our eyes. It was Black in the womb of our mother. Black is the beginning. And if we are the beginning, we will be forever. And with that, I would just like to hand it over to these artists. I believe Nykelle would be starting us off. And I'm not overstating when I say that, like, these are two artists who, when I think of how I would love to be seen, right, in a world where there wasn't oppressive, right, in a world free of this culture of domination, world to bell hooks, like these are two artists who are creating representations that feel that free to me. So thank you both.
Let me go into screen share and pull up my thank you for that presentation, and it is just an honor to be here. Nervous. My name is Nykelle DeVivo, non-binary trans, and currently located in Portland, Oregon, but I've spent so much of my life in the Bay Area. I graduated from the Art Institute, and I've been going to talks at SF Camerawork since I was a teenager, honestly. So this is really an honor. Just breathing. I want to highlight a few projects that I feel pertain to the ideals of tonight's conversation, and I wanted to start with my project I started about four years ago now, Flash to Spirit, or sorry, 5 years. So Flash to Spirit refers to the book of the same title by the recently deceased historian Robert Ferris Thompson, who wrote about a dance in West African cultures that involved a dancing with these wooden white and black masks that when twirled in the sun, they would create this effect that looked almost as a shine or a spark of light was embodying these figures. And it's understood that the flash of the spirit is entering into the host or the dancer, materializing in a form of ceremony. So, as in with voodoo, when the Lawal mounts the rider, the dancer becomes merely a vessel for or an expression of divine intervention, and the mask and the dancer themselves act as a portal between our world and that of spirit. So these images are all self-portraits, and as I don this reflective material, I attempt to make a direct connection to spirit as to allow space for spirit to enter into me. I'm trying to connect to my highest self as I learn, reflect, cleanse. They all act as a form of ritual for me. And this is actually the first image I made in the series in San Francisco, titled "I Leave You My Dream," in reference to Osho, whose writings I grew up with. And this is actually this piece is actually called "The All of Everything," in reference to my favorite piece by Sun Ra. So I feel like Sun Ra is going to be a large part of tonight's conversation, affected all of us in a lot of ways, beautiful ways. But I want to transition now into more of my traditional portraiture that I believe also symbolizes the thoughts of tonight's conversation. So I want to start with this self-portrait I made during the wildfires that plagued the Pacific Northwest in the summer of 2021. And I want to read a snippet that I originally said about the image, as I felt reflects the greater themes of my photographic practice. The West Coast is on fire because of our oppressors refusing to listen to the wisdom of those who have walked this land for time immemorial. Our planet is dying, and to begin healing would require returning to a sacred relationship between land and spirit, a practice that Black and Indigenous peoples hold within our blood. We aren't asking for space in their violent systems of oppression. The planet is telling us that that isn't enough. We want our power back as to create a world based in truth, simplicity, love, and service to our communities as to foster mutual growth. Much of my portraiture work I use to connect to my community of queer Black folk back home in Nebraska. I was actually raised in a small farm town called Wahoo, Nebraska. Represent. After graduation, I spent about 2 years back home working primarily with Polaroids, just documenting the community around me and the joy that we felt in each other. And before that, as I was living in the Bay Area, I was beginning to connect to spirituality and divine in general that I now associate with Blackness, from connecting to Louisiana voodoo that runs deep in my blood family to studying the languages of Afrofuturism. It led me to a lot of dark places to study these ideas. I see my art practice as a form of shadow work. I struggled much of my life with deep depression, feelings of alienation due to some of the traumas in my lives. And yeah, my work is my way of working through that, especially my portraiture and self-portraiture. So much of my practice has been self-portraiture. As I work through ideas of the divine, my relationship to gender and my transitioning that I'm just beginning now, and just the pain of growth. Yeah, this is a journey of becoming myself when I'm real, which is a phrase I refer to quite often. But this all leads me to my recent project on becoming, which is currently display at Camerawork. For 8 years now, I've been creating images for this project, and I'm just now beginning to kind of form a language for it, and I'm still in the process very much so of understanding it. So this is kind of where I'm at with it. But I think it's best for me to begin by talking a bit about my upbringing and parts of my spiritual journey that put this project in context. To start, I was adopted by at birth by white folk in rural Nebraska, in a town of about 200 people. And they ran one of the largest Hindu ashrams and metaphysical centers in the country at the time, in the 70s through the 90s. And yeah, I grew up being one of the only Black people in my entire county. But being raised in the temple, I gained a sense of reverence for higher powers, but through it, I never felt like it was my own language, which became more apparent as I grew older and found myself at odds with, existing in such a violently white space. And moving to the West Coast, I found myself searching for language that felt more like home. I became politically active at the beginning of Black Lives Matter. I found comfort in Black and brown elders who took me under their wings, and I took in every bit of Black literature, and music, and arts and creation that felt I've missed out on in my upbringing. Ultimately, I found the language of Afrofuturism along with the practices of traditional African spirituality, and began to find a means to understand my relationship to the divine in a way that felt more familiar to me. It was the same time I reconnected with my blood family. We connected when I was 18, and I started understanding deeper the roots of voodoo and a relationship to the South that runs deep in our family. Images I want to understand as representative of a dream space or of something of my imagination began to be understood as entranceways to timeless states of being or spaces of ancestor and spirit, of sacred and the divine. Images I made before I even understood myself as Black, in a sense, like this one I've made when I was doped out at like 16 or 17 in some Nebraska cornfield, later seemed closer to mythology or an origin story of Blackness than it was through the whiteness I understood at the time. And this all led me to believe that the visual language of Blackness and spirit was something that was innate. The more I became attuned to my true self, is the more I could see this language. On becoming, then, this project became a representation for my spiritual and visual process of decolonization. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a great deal of trauma to work through, just existing in the body I have, in the world that we now inhabit. And I always understood my practice as a way to move through that, again, as a form of shadow work. Something that has just been recently made apparent to me, though, during meditations, is that the land of spirit and ancestor and God is most commonly reached by death. Unbecoming becomes a representation of the afterlife, or more specifically, the project represents to me the in-between space of that world and that of the physical. I see entry to the world of spirit in gospel music, and shoes hanging on telephone cables, and branches that reach for the sun, or birds circling at a prey, and black tears and joy and pleasure and love and loss, in our skin, blood, and in God. I want to document the space of becoming, because I know that there's more than this capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchal hellhole of a physical existence that we've been placed into. And I also want to show that spirit has placed me here, because there's much more to be learned outside of heaven. I photographed to bear witness of God as a reminder, and as a prayer, and as a reflection of self. And I'm going to leave it at that for right now, as I feel like we'll get more into the meat of things as we move forward. Yeah, I'm going to end it with that. So thank you so much. And yeah, thank you for coming today. So let me end my screen share, and I will leave up to Ra to take over. Oh no, what did I do?
Wow, I literally wrote preaching, exclamation point, exclamation point. Thank you, Nykelle. And now I'll just pivot to Mikael.
Thank you, Nykelle, for the incredible presentation and for sharing your work. It's really just gorgeous and such a pleasure to be in conversation with you and with Ra tonight. I'm going to screen share. We always have our little switcheroos happening. But 1 second as I do that. So tonight I'm going to be sharing work from my body of work, Infinite Essence. So I think everybody can see it properly. 1 second, yeah, everything works. So yeah, and it's really been an honor to also collaborate on an ongoing basis with SF Camerawork. Last year around this time, I had an amazing conversation with Jonathan Kalm, who is on the board of SF Camerawork and have participated in 2 of the SF Camerawork annual auctions as well. And so it's really just been an incredible space that has really opened up conversations for alternative modes of imaging. I've felt like I've been able to find a home at SF Camerawork for my work that is a bit, that kind of steps out from a traditional mode of imaging. And it's just been amazing to be able to find like-minded people like Nykelle and Ra. And so thank you again, everybody, for joining us this evening. One of the things that can surprise people at first when they see this image is the understanding of it as photograph. And so just a bit about the process of creating the image. I begin by hand painting the model's bodies with fluorescent paints. And then I studied engineering in college. And so using my engineering background, I built my own flash that only transmits ultraviolet light. In total darkness, I click down on the shutter, and for a fraction of a second, the model's bodies are illuminated in the cosmic patterns that you see here. This series, Infinite Essence, was inspired in response to the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. I was really struck by the image of his body and how his body was left in the street for hours, and then the media took pictures of his body, and then shared it across the world without the consent of his family. And I kept seeing this barrage of images of Black death. I think we can all think about George Floyd just this past year, Belendo Castillo, Tamir Rice, the list goes on and on. And so I wanted to think about how could I use my skills as a photographer and my training as an engineer to transfigure Black bodies from sites of death and state violence into cosmic vessels of eternal life. And the answer I found, which was a breakthrough for me, was through my engagement with and research into African cosmological systems. And specifically being Nigerian and Igbo, I was reading about Igbo notions of the spirit and the soul. One of the spiritual bodies that we have in the Igbo context is the chi, which is seen as the spark that animates your existence. And Chinua Achebe, the Igbo novelist who wrote Things Fall Apart, wrote a reflection on the chi, and he said, or is the chi an infinitesimal manifestation of Chukwu's infinite essence, and Chukwu being the high God, the creator God, this primordial Blackness, one ray of the boundless radiance of the sun. And so I was really struck by that and thinking about the connection between our bodies and the celestial. And when I was reading that and thinking about that, and also going back to images that kind of connected to this idea of bringing quote unquote magic to the Black body, I heard a voice, and the voice said, put the sparkles on the body. And so I went through an iterative process of learning about glow in the dark paints, learning about fluorescent paints, and then how I could build my own ultraviolet flash to then transfigure the bodies within the images into the forms that you see here. And I then ground each of the images in myths, from specifically focusing on African-American myths, also myths from the Igbo context and from the Dogon context, which evoke really powerful and poetic systems of understanding Blackness as the divine source from which all life emerges. All of these deities, queer deities in many forms, also emanating from the primordial Blackness. And so I'm going to share a bit more about that as I continue through the presentation. But here you can see a glimpse of the creative process. On the right, you can see the paints, the fluorescent paints that I use to apply them onto the bodies. And on the left, you see an image of me I've also collaborated with a number of dancers. I've worked with dancers from Pittsburgh Ballet Theater, Alvin Ailey, Dance Theater of Harlem. And so I hand paint the bodies with these fluorescent paints that only glow under reaction with ultraviolet light. And so these are two dancers that I've collaborated pretty extensively with, and also feature in the film that I co-directed with Marcus Red, Corey Boubinier, and Victoria Watford. And here you can get a glimpse of the actual process of the activation and the transfiguration that takes place in the image making process. So on the right, you can see the model in the visible spectrum. If you look really closely, you can see that there's a few specks of paint that are visible in the visible spectrum. And so his body is already painted, but you can't really see the paints in the visible spectrum. And so here you see me here with my ultraviolet flash that I constructed. And then I turn off the lights, I click down on the shutter. And when I click down on the shutter, a beam of ultraviolet light is emitted from the flash and that light interacts with the paints on the model's bodies. An effect is induced known as ultraviolet induced fluorescence, where the paints on the bodies absorb the energy of the ultraviolet light. Then there is a step change, and a portion of that energy is released in the visible spectrum for a fraction of a second. That fluorescence, that momentary fluorescence, is then captured onto the camera sensor. And that is where you see the image on the left that is created. I think a lot with my practice also about this space of like this emergence from Blackness. So as I sit in the space, I see this, it's a completely Black space, and you see this glowing celestial figure emerge and then disappear back into the Blackness again, which also recreates the creation sequences from African cosmological myths and stories. And also thinking about how within the visible spectrum, there's all these systems of oppression that have been created, like specifically anti-Blackness and racism and white supremacy. But if we transcend what's visible to the human eye alone, Blackness is illuminated as a divine causic principle of the universe, which transcends all life. I'm going to share two other images from Infinite Essence, and then I'll showcase some work from my current body of work, Cosmologies. If you've heard of the myth of the Flying African, it's an African-American myth, put it in the chat. And so this myth is dedicated to that African-American myth. And Throughout the United States, and particularly along the coasts of Georgia and South Carolina, there persist to this day stories of enslaved Africans who were able to escape bondage by taking flight and returning to their African homelands. There are many hypotheses as to the origin of this myth, but many people point to an 1803 slave rebellion known as Igbo Landing, which took place on St. Simon's Island in Georgia, where a group of enslaved Igbo people, they overthrew their captors aboard a slave ship, and then they drove the ship ashore. And then rather than be recaptured, they walked into a creek and they drowned themselves. And as they entered the water, they chanted, "The water spirit brought us, the water spirit will take us home," and were thus transported to the primordial blackness from which everything emerged. So this is the flying African. I've also been really captured in my research. I've done a lot of extensive research into primary source documents by Ibo Dibias, for example, looking into French anthropological texts that have researched the Dogon cosmology in modern day Mali. And in those texts, it's really been incredible to see the ways in which indigenous African knowledge systems and spiritual systems had an innate knowledge of the connection between the human body and interstellar and planetary contexts. And the ways in which, because we're composed of the same components as the stars, we could communicate with the stars and remote view them. And so a fascinating story I came across, and the piece is titled "The Vision of Inikozo," was of Inikozo Dolo, who was a celebrated Dogon diviner and priestess of Ama, the creator god. And she would close her eyes, and she was adept at fusing the blackness of her inner imaginal worlds with the external blackness of space. And she would delve into the womb of Ama, the creator god, and have these visionary experiences and perceptions of stars and celestial bodies. And in 1949, she shared with French anthropologists the weight, size, composition, and color of the star Sirius B, a star which is impossible to detect with the unaided human eye and was only detected by Europeans with telescopes in the mid 1800s, while the Dogon have been celebrating festivals around Sirius B for millennia. So it's just a really incredible way to think about the way in which African systems have been able to use this as a way to literally communicate with stars and view them. So I worked on Infinite Essence between 2017 and 2019. And then between 2019 and 2021, I began work on my follow-up body of work, Cosmologies, which really was exploring specific, again, creation myths, and then also augmenting it with new ultraviolet lighting tools that I also have now. And so Cosmologies was featured in my first solo show in New York, first solo gallery show in New York at Clamp Art Gallery in Chelsea in September. And so here you can get an exhibition view, which is also my virtual background. So I'm still in the gallery with the images in some ways. So here you can see also, this is the evolution of the body of work in terms of my technical skills. I'm now working with synchronized ultraviolet strobes as well in my work, painting the backgrounds as well. And I've been really thinking a lot about, my original space in which I came into the work was thinking about these themes of Black Death and the murders of Michael Brown and many other Black people in this country. And thinking about these themes also within African myths of resurrection and how death, sacrifice, and resurrection create entire universes. And so I was drawn to this specific Igbo myth that's evoked in this image. And so this image is titled "The Martyrdom of Eke Netchukwu," and it was featured also in the last SF Camerawork auction. And in the Igbo creation story, at the beginning of the universe, all was one in the blackness of space. And you had two polarities, the masculine polarity, Chukwu, and the feminine polarity, Eke Netchukwu. And they existed in total harmony until Chukwu sectioned off a corner of space exclusively for himself. Eke Netchukwu became overwhelmed with curiosity to see what Chukwu was doing inside of his chamber. And she entered into his chamber. And in one moment, when she entered into the chamber, a massive explosion ripped through the universe. In the aftermath of the explosion, Chukwu exits his chamber, he discovers her body, and he begins to weep in despair over her body. So this is the martyrdom of Eke Netchukwu, and we're going to see the rest of this mythical sequence play out over the upcoming images. So this is an installation view of the image. This is the image works are printed onto, die sublimated onto aluminum metal plates at 24 by 36 and 40 by 60 inches. Metal within African cosmological systems is a spiritual substance that connects us to the forges of the forgers of the original smiths, the hearts of the cores of the stars, and so I use that also in the material choice. So in the last image, you saw the martyrdom of Eke Netchukwu as the cosmic explosion takes place. After Chukwu finds her body and begins to cry over her, in one spectacular moment, his tears heal, they purify her, and she rises from the dead. And so you see here the resurrection of Eke Netchukwu after this explosion. You can see the divine tears of Chukwu raining down upon her. And as she rises from the dead, her body holds the memory of what happened right before the explosion. You see her hand as she was spinning the universe into existence, and her foot arched as she was sneaking into Chukwu's chamber. Here you can see the installation view on the left, and on the right is the following image in the sequence. After the resurrection of Eke Netchukwu, you see the next step, next stage in the myth. On the left is Eke Netchukwu, who now, as she rises from the dead, she assumes the form of Komosu, and this honorific is a derivative of Koromayasu, or the body of the goddess, which signifies that her resurrected body becomes the entirety of the physical universe in which we exist. And so when Eke Netchukwu rises from the dead as Komosu, we are living on and are emanations of Eke Netchukwu's resurrected body. The entire universe is her resurrected body. Chukwu, on the other hand, following the cosmic explosion and the death and resurrection of his feminine double, never fully recovers from the traumatic shock of the event. He, disenchanted and sensing the inevitable spiritual shortcomings of this new state of the universe, he retreats into his pillared chamber and he irrevocably locks its door of mercy behind him. So this is Chukwu after the cosmic explosion, Chukwu's grief. After Eke Netchukwu is resurrected as Komosu, she then emanates onto Earth and becomes the Earth itself. So this is Eke Netchukwu in the form of Alawuala, or the Earth goddess in Igbo cosmology. And her name translates literally as the land which is the ultimate Earth. She incarnates the spiritual principles of the resurrected Komosu, birthing the ancestors of humanity and terrestrial life from the blackness of her primal womb. Her layered waist beads, which you can see here, speak to her control of fertility in all dimensions of life, and her sinuous pose prefigure her zoomorphic terrestrial form as Eke Nwe Oya, the sacred Igbo python. And so the collection of these myths and stories, which have become really fundamental for me in terms of my understanding of Blackness, the potentiality of Blackness, and this primordial Blackness that creates the entire universe, are collected into the exhibition catalog Cosmologies. It's available in limited edition, and you can find it on my website, mikaelowunna.com/books. It'll take you to a link to then contact the gallery, but it'll kind of direct you along the way. And it's accompanied by an essay by me, an essay by my collaborator, Marcus Red, on the primordial Blackness. And then there's also a conversation between me and a Black queer British photographer, Ajamu X. And the last project I'm going to share in terms of the development of my work has been that, so as Cosmologies came out, I have been thinking a lot about how to bring my work into multimedia spaces, to create immersive experiences that can bathe us in these understandings of the cosmos, the Black body, and these African myths that guide us to a reconfigured understanding of Blackness and what the possibilities are entailed within Blackness. And so in fall of 2021, I co-directed with Marcus Red, who also wrote for the catalog, the film Obi Umbu, The Primordial House. And so it debuted in New York at Clamp Art Gallery, and then it also showcased at Iris Project Gallery in LA, and at Contemporary Art Museum Raleigh, and also at the Esalen Institute in December. And we're applying for some film festivals. So hopefully you'll be able to see it also in some other areas. And if other people are interested in, or know other venues that might be interested in showcasing the film, please let me know. I'm going to showcase a 1-minute trailer and then before I close out. And the work is currently on view, some of my images and also the film in certain cases right now at Contemporary Art Museum Raleigh through February 13th, but it's actually going to be extended through at least the spring. And also there's currently a public art installation in Pittsburgh where I live. I'm through the end of the month. And then I'm also part of a show at the National Museum of Art. So thank you again, everybody, and excited for the conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. I mean, brilliant, literally. Nykelle, please join us back on camera. Well, I thought that one way for us to start, and just to kind of aid in our digestion as everyone continues to take in all the depth and beauty that you both have presented, would be to define some terms, to come to some shared understandings and working definitions of words that feel central to the worlds you all are creating and imaging through your work. The first of those words being Blackness. So would you all mind just offering your kind of working understanding of Blackness?
Oh, this is so exciting. Nykelle, do you want to go?
Yeah, of course. I'm trying to. I have it written down. I don't know why I had to look off into the distance. But to me, it's just, I mean, I start with just saying I'm, but I have to say it as a space before and after time. I always understood it as like an origin story, but if it's after time, then it's something that is always present. So to me, like Blackness is always just kind of personified the everything, I think that you refer to that in the space of your work very much. And let me bounce to you for a second. Let me bounce to you.
Yeah. So one, I read there's an amazing so Marcus, who I've collaborated with. I think you know Marcus, Ra, potentially. Marcus is at Berkeley, too.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay,
Anyway, it's small world. But Marcus read, my collaborator, co-director of my film, and frequent collaborator, wrote an amazing scholarly article, Astro Black Mythology, which evokes the sun Ra poem by the same name, Astro Black Mythology, and really dissects Astro Black mythology and how sun Ra was kind of describing it and thinking through it. And in Marcus's article, he describes Blackness as a divine cosmic principle of the universe. And in that, you can think of Blackness in a multimodal way. The blackness of space at the beginning of existence, from which the entire universe emerges. You can think of the blackness of the womb, from which all life emerges. The blackness of the first people, the blackness of the earth, the blackness of the depth of the deep ocean. And so Blackness also as this primordial space, the first space, uh, and also this androgynous space too, which is one thing that I think many African mythological systems evokes in a really powerful way. Blackness as this primordial androgyny that then creates the entire universe. And so within that, you then have this understanding that especially connects to queerness as well, because also within African and African indigenous systems, and Malidoma Somé, who just recently passed away, had an incredible conversation where he talked about how within African traditional societies, queer people, because we could vibrate both masculine and feminine energy, were understood as maintaining a special connection to the creator, because creator was this primordial androgynous blackness. And we were the gatekeepers to the spirit world. We were the diviners, we were the healers. And so also it was exciting to hear, Nykelle, you also talking about your own practice and shadow work and how this is a spiritual practice for you as well, because that's something that, this idea of the blackness and this primordial androgyny and the space for queer people within that and connection to that has been evoked across time within African systems, and also connected to the Sun Ra poem as well.
Yeah, I mean, thinking of my practices as a form of decolonization just feels like the more that I unlearn any type of light or any type of understanding that is outside of, an innate blackness, the more I move in just an androgyny or a queerness that is outside of any kind of bounds. Pretty much connect to how you put language to that, because it's just like, there's nothing more freeing in my understanding of self than going back to initial state. I look back at even my baby photos, I'm like, oh wow, I understood who I was at birth, because that was before I was conditioned to know anything else. So it's like the most primal state before any type of, before whiteness in a sense can touch it in any way or make it unpure, was existing as just as being. And I think that, like you said, that being state is free from a male or a female. It just is.
Yeah, this unconditioned state of totality. The last thing I'll say too is that Kemet, which is the ancient Egyptian word for their own nation, meant the black land. So I think there's also this innate understanding also with also Sun Ra evokes, which which has been ancestrally evoked of the blackness as this generative force.
Yes, well, I would not be who I am, parishioner of the Church of Black Feminist Thought, if I did not slide in some Black feminist citations. Everything y'all just said is reminding me of an essay by Toni K. Bambara called On the Issue of Roles. That was, I feel like it was published in the anthology she edited called The Black Woman, but I feel like the date it was actually written or given as a speech was like in the late 60s. But in this essay, she literally says, like, perhaps we need to let go of all notions of manhood and womanhood and turns towards Blackhood, which for her is this task of creating like truly revolutionary selves, a truly revolutionary androgynous self. That was what made me think of it, this word, this primordial androgyny, just as a way of really grounding in the work necessary to bring about the liberation we desire. So now my head and my heart is spinning as I think about that revolutionary desire in conversation with the celestial, with the interstellar, as you all have weaved together for us. Thank you. All right, next word is light.
Something that first touched me is, I wrote it as the creation of shadow, and the greatness of blackness, in the same way that like yin is to yang, like we, especially in this moment now, can only understand blackness through a context of whiteness. What's that quote that says, "I feel most black against a stark white wall"?
Yes, yes.
Um, and so, I think especially like, within my practice, especially, there's the deep shadows that end up existing are created by this abrasive light, and this white light that comes in almost feels violent, but it illuminates, like, it's in what you can't see that you get the most depths of blackness, I feel. And I feel like in those deep shadows is where it exists. So I feel like, and it's strange because, like, how can I imagine a world without this like illuminating white light to understand my my relationship to blackness? But that's just the world I live in. Like, what is it to exist in a world where the light doesn't exist? But then also at the same time, light gives life. Light gives energy. Light gives warmth. And so it's like, how can something be so violent and the same side be so darkening? Is light more dark than it is light?
I feel like Mikael has some science for us on that very point.
Well, it's interesting. When you were asking the question to, thinking about light as differentiation, like an emergence from the blackness, right? And so I was thinking also about Dogon creation myth from modern day Mali, and within the Dogon, so this kind of Dogon spiritual science, at the beginning of the universe, again, all was one in this primordial blackness, androgynous blackness of the creator god Amma, who held within themselves 266 signs of creation in this primal egg. And in this one moment, Amma opens their eyes. And when they open their eyes, these signs of creation spill forth out of them and create the universe. And so you can think of this function of the opening of the eyes as also literally being kind of, for ourselves, going from this state of this undifferentiated monolithic state of this primordial androgynous blackness to then light emerging and differentiation coming into being, and also creation coming into being. And so that's how I've also been seeing light. And also within my practice, it's been interesting using a spectrum of light that's invisible to the human eye, ultraviolet light, to illuminate a vision of blackness which is invisible to us. And so I think light has played a really important role in my practice, and also has been really central for, I think, for photographers, particularly Black photographers, in terms of thinking through how to use it to image and interrogate imaging of the Black body and Black people.
Is light, then, can I ask, like, the beginning of duality?
Mm-hmm.
I almost feel like I'm in a seminar. Like, I feel like I know that this is like, an open thing and we're talking to people and all this stuff, but I just feel like there's such deep like knowledge transfer and genuine curiosity moving between us that I feel like I am in a divine classroom. I have a question that has come and interrupted my flow. I'm thinking about just the depth of thought and care and real like spiritual labor in both of you all's practice. And I guess I'm wondering if you'll speak to what, kind of like rituals of preparation and aftercare are aiding you as you move through these like relations with Blackness and light in your practice, in your physical practice.
Mm-hmm. No, Nykelle, you go, because I remember I was really curious, particularly when you were presenting and talking about shadow work, also your definition of shadow work, and your practice too. So yeah.
Yeah. I think I would say I first noticed that when in Creation of Flash's Spirit, where it was it's strange because it's these images that have almost like a perfect template. Like, I'm gonna go and put this cloth over me and stand in this bucolic place, and I'm going to do this thing, this template. but every time that I end up creating images that I truly love, I remember like there's almost this frustration as I'm trying to create this. And in that, I just have to let go. I'm like, I just have to free myself of any of those expectations. In that moment, I enter into that state of you know, as all artists kind of do, where I'm just creating and I'm not thinking, and I'm just feeling the motions of timer and light, and you know, all the things I have to envision as I'm creating this image. The technicalities just start to wash away, and I just am in that moment. And you know, I saw that as, you know, spirit entering in. But like in terms of like, you know, the pain, I mean, a lot of those images, especially on becoming, you know, like half the images come out of, you know, really dark spaces of dealing with traumas or dealing with depression or dealing with like you know, literally photographing as I'm going through those almost like psychotic breaks, and this kind of like documentation, or images that originally acted as documentation ended up becoming like, okay, this is where I was. So I felt like I was one photographing image. I tried to like have images in that project that showed, you know, the lowest state of being and creating and the process of becoming, to the images where I'm just letting spirit into me. And I felt like it was important to kind of like show all the stages of, again, it's sounding like a broken record, but becoming, you know, and healing from that. I don't think I've ever really healed from that. I think I'm just going to continue like putting it out on the line, and it's just like, oh, this is me along this process of figuring it out. The world will never, you know, stop giving me material to feel about.
Ain't that the truth? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think similar. I think for me, I think if I go earlier in how I became an artist, right, and why I even started creating images, was when I was a freshman in college. So I studied engineering in college, but when I was a freshman in college, I was outed to my family members in Nigeria. And I went back to Nigeria for Christmas. And when I went back to Nigeria for Christmas, we were in our village where we came, been there for generations. And I was put through a series of exorcisms due to my sexuality. And from that space, I fell into a long spiral of anxiety and depression as I was kind of struggling with these two facets of my identity, being queer and African. And 6 months later, I picked up a camera, and when I picked up the camera, I felt like I found my voice again. And so I continued working with photography. And then one of the big pivot points was when I found the work of Malidoma Somé, who described the traditional role for queer people within African societies, and first gave me the first understanding of this primordial androgynous Blackness, this special connection to the creator, this special capacity for divination, mystic talents that queer people hold and have held within African traditional societies. And when I came into I was beginning to explore that more through my practice. And then with the Infinite Essence body of work was the big, like for me, what kind of came was when I was reading about Igbo spirituality, these Igbo notions of the spirit, and literally hearing a voice, right? And that told me to put the paints onto the body. And so put the sparkles onto the body. And the ritual practice has become a ongoing space of creating work that then always puts me another step forward on my own spiritual journey and spiritual path. Even with creating the film with Marcus, a large part of the practice of how we created the film was through meditation, was through visualization. And there was even a part before we even shot the film, because it's a 30-minute dance film, where we, through meditative trance, we entered into the chamber and and met the deities. And the deities told us how they wanted to dance and how they wanted to be represented. And then it was really fascinating because months later, after we finished shooting, the lead dancer in the film told us that she was having all these health issues, and then I had some type of reading done, and she found out that the deity that was guarding her and protecting her and was helping her out as she kind of was overcoming these health issues was Eke Nechuku, the deity who she'd represented in the film. And so ritual practice has become an ongoing way to engage with this Blackness as this healing generative force, and then to also put all of us, I think, a step further in terms of understanding the full potentiality of this, literally this infinite nature of this Blackness.
Oh, yes, chills and warmth, just like a deep warmth and a softening as I listen to you all discuss the ritual. Sorry, it's a cough drop. The ritual elements of your work. I know I had other definitions that I wanted us to share, but I'm feeling called to invite y'all to reflect on, you both are using the photographic medium to hold like the inner truths or the inner myths of Blackness. And I'm wondering how you see yourself in your work contending with and kind of interrupting the more like violent and predatory elements of photography and of the history of photography as it relates to the Black body. Mikael, you've spoken a little bit about that in terms of like, that moment that we're still in, right? Of just like the vast and like almost like pornographic proliferation of images of Black death and dying and suffering. And I guess I'm wondering, I would love to hear more from you all about like, what does it mean to you that you have kind of reappropriated photographic technologies in these particular ways?
Yeah, I think so. What really was the impetus for the Infinite Essence project was, as I mentioned before, like the murder of Michael Brown, and just really feeling called to think about how could I transfigure Black bodies from these images that are presented before us into Blackness as these cosmic vessels. And as it's kind of also enshrined within our African cosmological system. So again, this movement between the past into the present, into the future, to then illuminate an alternative vision of the Black body. One of the things that I also really think about too is the power of image. And if you imagine, for example, being in ancient Egypt or in another like African pre-colonial African civilization and walking around, but particularly ancient Egypt, walking around and everywhere you turn, you see an image of yourself as a god. Versus in the society that we're in, like turning and everywhere you see is kind of like, either it's like advertisements for like alcohol or other things, or literally images of Black people just dying and being killed. And so I think it literally creates it has an effect on us vibrationally and so I think the image is so powerful. And so the image making I do is trying to also reclaim this ancestral understanding of how artistic practice can be used to elevate human consciousness and return us back to this primordial Blackness, this Blackness that can then heal and create an entirely new universe.
I have this friend who works for this organization of Indigenous elders across the world, and as they were starting to work with them, they had the apprehension in a sense, because they were saying, this org is less like love and connectedness, and we need to like return to our knowledge. And they were just like, well, what about white supremacy? What about colonialism? And they were just like, the elders said to them like, well, yeah, we know the young people are angry, and we know, we've seen it, we've gone through it so many times. And can we use this information, this knowledge that we have, to move us forward? Like this historic, this power that we have within, this connectedness that we could have. And so, I think of like the beginning of my practice when I was, early on of BLM, and watching everyone just again watching this pornographic imagery that just hurt me so much. I originally made images that were just as violent. I met the violence with the violence. I did performance pieces where I was like fucking with cop cars in the physical world, trying to instigate, trying to be a part of it. And there was something in that. But then, I switched at a moment in college. And it was also at the moment when I was like understanding my queerness, where I was just like, flesh is spirit. What is that? What does it mean to connect to something higher? And is there something freeing in that? And for a long time, I had this kind of imposter syndrome. It's like, oh, I'm deciding to just make work about the divine, and it's ignoring the fact that this violence exists. But it's just like, I think that there's a way to do that, as the elder said, this and
Yes.
that I'm just kind of now figuring out what that means. I think like I'm becoming it's not done yet because I haven't figured out how to do that dance. But yeah, I think that, oh wait, what was the original thing that we were talking about? Sorry. I think that
I love where you're going, so keep going there.
yeah. I think that there's this space that we can return to of ancestral knowledge and information that is healing in. So how does my practice contend with that violence? Is a lot of times I'd say it doesn't, and most of the times, especially when I see it existing in a gallery or in other like violent spaces, I'm like, oh, at first it's like, how can I bring this Black energy and take over the space and make it something sacred for us, by us? And I'm like, anytime I've still shown in a white wall gallery, I always feel like it's just not doing it. And then I have moments where my work ends up being like, I make really tiny prints and I give them to the people I love in my life. And I've been told, oh, I put this on my altar. I put this over the doorway to my house as a form of protection. I put this, and it's like, that is to me the ultimate honor that someone can give to me. Because I feel like I feel like that's a big part of, the origins of art for our people is always had a practical purpose. And so to me, it's like, I feel like my art does something to mitigate that violence when it can actually practically be used for our people, for some type of healing, for some type of growth, for some type of protection.
Yes, and I think that process, that work is it. Like, I think that is the point. I'm thinking about Malidoma Somé, who you brought in, Mikael, and that hailing of the queer beings as the gatekeepers, right? What does that mean? I'm also, thinking with the work of the late Bell Hooks and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, thinking about folks who were militant in the way that they loved, right? Who thought about love as a militant practice to overturn a culture of domination, and how that's not a frivolous thing. Like, I think, as you were citing, Nykelle, and as many of us have kind of felt through, and as like generations before us have felt through, there's that moment of rage that is so righteous and so like earned. And I think there is definitely something that I'm feeling through with you all around the need to really attend to kind of like the spiritual dimensions of our beingness here. And so I think it's really invaluable, the work that you all are doing in offering these exalted openings, like these portals into. And it's not like, spiritual bypass where we're just like, we're gods and like it's fine, but it's like this really deep reckoning through this primordial androgyny, through darkness and all its implications, right? The darkness of a depressive episode, the darkness of, even like the mass suicide event of Evo Landing, right? And all the openings and new understandings of that particular mythology. I'm just really kind of like swept away and moved by the deep work that you all are doing. I'm gonna check to see now if we have any audience questions. Let's see. I think this one is for Nykelle. Regarding the new project, this person, Michelle Branch, is interested in what looks like the move from color and prior work to high contrast, black and white. and why you made that choice and what it might signify in the theory and practice and materiality of your work.
Yeah, I think, and I guess this is the reference, like, traditional photography is, to me, there's always been like this, a classicalness, and there's always been a reference to like a pastness in the use of black and white. And being trained at, especially at the Art Institute, the photographers that brought me to that school was like, Robert Adams and the 64 click. It's like I was very much like rooted and like understood my relationship to photography in contrast to those. So to me, like, to mess with that history is like been a big part of my practice. But especially with On Becoming, I feel the use of black and white just a lot of times is a reference to the death that the work is speaking about. I think it's always been, black and white is something that we've now symbolically used now that we have color, just to say like, oh, the opposite of this life is this, like, is this darkness of without color. And it's strange, like, representing black bodies with black and white to I don't necessarily mean it as a violent act in a sense, but more so to say that, like, death is a coming. um I'm very much into the belief of like, what is it? In the same way that slave ships kind of, or sorry, the same way that hurricanes follow the path of slave ships, I very much believe that, the violence that has been enacted against us through all this time against Black, Indigenous people to this world will summon the end of this world. Maybe I'm just a Afro pessimist and a nihilist, but I believe that the end is needed to kind of cleanse us. So to me, it's like the black and white reference is not only like, it references an end, it references the death. And you can't really see in the photos I've shown digitally, but they're also shown on like a reflective metallic paper, archival paper that also has a shine to it. So I tried to like get that, there's this underlying depth to that darkness, but there is still like a presence looming.
One thing that's really interesting there, Nykelle, talking about the end as you were discussing, is that in an Igbo cosmological context, in Nigeria, I was learning about this concept of the four world ages. You actually also find this within a Hindu context as well. And one of the things that was really fascinating in the four world ages is that it's a cycle as well. And so at the beginning, in the first world age, all is one in this blackness, again, like this kind of undifferentiated state. Then in the next age, then you have the emergence of consciousness, the emergence of differentiation. Then in the subsequent age, the third age, this is Uganwu, this is the age of light, where you have the rise of civilizations. You can think of this as being kind of like the civilizations of ancient Egypt, all these civilizations across the world. You also have the emergence of patriarchy. You also have the emergence of war, etc. And then at the end of that age, the great sages of that age, they're able to kind of harness all of these incredible might, all these incredible feats and monuments, etc., because they are able to communicate with the primordial blackness. Mm-hmm. At the end of that age, they were able to see that in the coming age, the next age was Ugazi, or the age of suffering, where any technology that was developed would be used to destroy. And so at the end of that age, they refused to share any of their mystic secrets with the subsequent generations. So people look and they're like, oh, how do people do this thing? Because they refuse to share their secrets. And so actually currently in the Igbo context, we're in Ugazi, the age of suffering, where again, everything is used to destroy, and any new development is used to also destroy. But what also happens at the end of this cosmic age, we return to the age of Ugaka, the age of unity, where literally there's no differentiation between us and nature or the cosmos. And so that's actually the next age that's to come at the end of this age that will then resurrect the primordial house. So,
can I ask, do you think that that age to come is going to be something that we physically achieve, or do you think that that's something that, you know, we'll transition to? And I guess that's, to me, is like the idea of death, like taking us to that space.
well, I think it can look like many different things, right? But I think at that stage, the differentiation between your body and your mind, there's no differentiation between you and the creator. So there's no differentiation between you and the universe. So it's like it's a little bit hard even for us to conceptualize, because you are everything and everything is you. And so like, this is when you could think of like literally just complete like telekinesis, telepathy, because there's no differentiation between anything. So yeah, it will look very different, but that's what in the Igbo world ages, that's what's to come at the end of the age of suffering. And then the cycle continues and returns.
Yo, we gonna have to have a book club or something, because I need to know everything and we don't have enough time. Oh, but I'm here, like I'm so drawn in. We have a couple more questions. Nykelle, I know as soon as you said the AP word, somebody was gonna ask about it. So we have a question that's interested in how your work dealing with the languages of Afrofuturism is in conversation with this idea of Afro-pessimism, and how do you see it as a conversation, or do you see it as opposition? And then I'll put the second question in the room too, for the sake of time. And it's a question about how spiritual and ritual practice, like what do you see Black folks immediately taking from an engagement with your work in the realm of spiritual and ritual practice? Yeah, so those two are on the floor.
Okay. I am an incredibly nihilistic person, and the further we go into this world, the deeper and deeper it comes, to a point where I can't even create images for like flash of spirit. I can't even create self-portraits. I can't even like go move through the world in a way that feels like my true, authentic queer self. Like, I just have been like, I'm just existing, waiting for the world to end. And I feel like that's where like the Afro-pessimism meets with my work, where it's just like, I don't really see any possible means out other than an end. It's so deeply rooted. Like, I personally can't see myself as anything other than a slave to this world. But then, beginning of this year, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to force myself to create a flash of the spirit image again. Now it's the first image you saw in my slide, where it's just like, let me try to have, if the end is coming, if nothing matters in that nihilism, let me try to envision space that will come after. And so I guess, I know who asked that question. I think, where I envision my practice going is I want to deepen an understanding of where we go afterwards. And I want to, like, in the same way that my practice or becoming focuses on the transition between like the physical world and spirit, I want to like go more in depth with that. And I want to like understand, what does it mean to transition from that deep-seated rage and anger to, the possible pleasure that can come from leaving it all behind. And so I guess Afropessimism is more so just like, I reference it more so to say, this is hard to make work anymore. Stop the period.
And no, thank you. I think if anything, Afro-pessimism, who for, I don't like it's kind of a buzzword in the space that I move in, like Black studies, visual culture, scholarship, it's a thing. But I think what it is definitely is a brilliant description of the problem space, right? Which you've just laid out for us, Nykelle, this kind of inescapable hold, the age of suffering, right? As Mikael has articulated, but within a particular context of the African American experience, which has its limitations. And I love the texture of this dialogue, and I love just the real lived in tension between the desire and the necessity of envisioning that after, and the kind of hold of suffering. Like I could go in 1,000 places with kind of expanding on how I feel about studying suffering and spirituality in my personal practice, but for the sake of time and in hopes that y'all will talk to me later about those things. I think we should move on. I know we're right up on the edge. We have about 7 minutes left, but do y'all feel like we have time for one more question, or should we move to close? One more.
Yeah, and I also wanted to say quickly too was, I think we were discussing the space of artistic practice as ritual practice, right? And one of the pieces, which I think you can even see, for example, in Sun Ra's artistic practice, is that through the artistic work and ritual, you can transport humanity, Black people, into another state of being, right? And so also even within that Igbo myth that I shared, it wasn't that everything that we do is meaningless. It was that through ritual, through holistic living, you can restore and resurrect the primordial house in that age of unity again. And so I think that was the one thing I wanted to make sure to offer up was that ritual practice has that function within it too.
I know that has certainly been true for me over these past few years. I'm sure in our own ways we could each, and probably like the big we of Black folks today, could trace like a path of intellectual, creative, and spiritual evolution from 2015 to where we find ourselves now. And that might not be linear. I don't mean to imply like a linear progression, but I think, a portal was opened that we still have found ourselves in. And I do think there's been a particular function of ritual practice, of creative practice, of spiritual technology that has shown up specifically for a lot of Black queer people. And I don't think that that's an incident. So our final question from the audience comes from Chanel Stone, and they ask, for Nykelle, they noticed that in your Black and white photographs, there's an inexplicable and literal texture to them that loosely reminds of Xerox. And this texture makes them think of the constant reproduction, circulation, and consumption of images of Black bodies. It also makes me think of the impossibility of Blackness. Do you deliberately lean into the limits of the physical photograph in your practice?
Yes and no. A lot of the style that is in my work is due to making do with the means I've had. I mean, most of the images you see are either done with a Polaroid or a $200 point, or like $100 point and shoot or toy camera set I could just kind of afford through the years. But I mean, conceptually, my thesis for undergraduate was on the works of the Japanese photographers of post-war Japanese photographers of Provoke, and trying to like link in them to say like, is there a Black aesthetic in photography? And if so, have Black people even used it yet? And and I was trying to make the arguments, not very well, that the Japanese were the closest to understanding like a non-white way of using the camera, because they just were so uninterested with the purity and the singularity of the image you know, you'd have 1,000 images that were, you know, Xeroxes rummaged together that became, you know, you kind of walk through the gallery, you walk through the, especially the book, and it becomes more about the emotionality of moving through the space, let alone, you know, instead of this moment. And I think, you know, the core of Blackness is something that is not fixed. It's something that's timeless. It's something that's here now and then and before. So, you know, I think a lot of that aesthetic kind of comes from ruminating on those photographers and having this like acceptance of, not acceptance, this kind of, I guess that goes to one of your earlier questions of how are you dealing with you know, the histories of violence of photography. Is like, I just want to escape the finiteness of the singular image of this pure sacred moment, to say that, like, you know, we exist before and after that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's also, oh, sorry, can I say one other thing? It feels really weird that like right now, especially in like Black aesthetics photography, there's this hyper fixation on these like bucolic color editorial photos of like a Black stereotypically, you know, beautiful person and light-skinned usually, and really nice clothes, being regal in a white person's position. It's just like us taking up a white space isn't really, you know, any form of liberation. So it's just like, what does it mean for like Black image making? And I think of the work of oh goodness, who is it, who, for Ming Smith, you know, who is just kind of like saying, no, like it's not about this specificity. It's like, how can we like be free of that? So yeah, I think that's where I was
Mhm.
going with the texture.
Thank you. Mikael, do you have any like thoughts or comments on like the kind of physical limits of the photograph? I was really drawn in by your choice to show your images on metal. So I know that there is some thought that you give to the materiality of the photograph and maybe the limits of paper in presenting the stories that you desire to tell.
Yeah, well, I think I've been moving across media in like a pretty significant way. I think incorporating paint and then like ultraviolet light into my practice was one way of, I think, playing with and also referencing a larger history of photographic surrealism as a way to transcend the present moment. With the material choices too, it's like I'm also referencing histories of African metallurgy and
Mhm.
thinking about how can I tie the African mythological context of the work and the possibility that those provide to a contemporary medium through the use of print media like metal. And that connects to like the sacred smith, the Deme Na from the Dogon, the sacred bronze metallurgy traditions of Igbo Ukwu, Leje, etc., in Igbo land, etc. And so I think those have been really important for me. And then also, I think recently moving into moving images has been an alternative way to think about how do I create an immersive world, right? Because I think one of the ways in which we can transcend the limits of our reality is when we are literally immersed in every facet with healing images of Blackness that connect us to the creator. And so I'm even working with sculpture with three-dimensional forms as well to then expand that palette and expand those modes of possibility.
Thank you. In a sense, you're following the myth towards the medium as opposed to the other way around. Wow, thank you all so much. Before I move to close, is there anything that y'all would like to say to each other in this forum? Or any like words of closure that you'd like to offer?
Well, congratulations, Nykelle, on your show. Very exciting, really great to be in conversation. Ra, thank you for this. Thank you for the incredible space, for the generous space. Thank you, SF Camerawork, for hosting us. I mean, that would be my last word.
And for me, I mean, just, yeah, it's It's so cool to share space with y'all. Like, I don't know, this is what I do it for, and like y'all's minds are just great. And also, you know, big ups to SF Camerawork. This is this is a moment, and I'm really appreciative for it.
I mean, before I pass it back to Olivia, I want to end where we began, just in the name of cyclical time, and repeat that Sonia Sanchez quote, which says, "Black is the beginning of everything. It was Black in the universe before the sun. It was Black in the mind before we opened our eyes. It was Black in the womb of our mother. Black is the beginning. And if we are the beginning, we will be forever." And that definitely rings with a whole new level of meaning after all the worlds you've presented for us today. So thank you both.
Wow, thank you. I don't even know if I want to say anything more. That was spectacular. Thank you all so much for this incredibly deep and moving conversation. We really appreciate how you've articulated how photography has allowed you to bare your souls and how you've gifted your stories to us through your work and through your words. So thank you so much. It's been a really beautiful time, and I encourage everyone to come back to us next Tuesday for more amazing words from another artist in the Forecast show, Trent Bozeman. And just want to say thank you. And if you've been moved by this program, these programs do support the artists in many ways with financial support as well as platform to share their work. So if that's meaningful to you, help us make these possible. Help us give back to our artists by visiting our donation page. Anyway, here's my cat as well, saying hello. And thank you so much. And we hope to see you again next week. Thank all three of you. It was just really an amazing, amazing panel. So thank you.